Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're using the power of blood to obliterate our enemies with a super cool modded class, the Blood Sorcerer. This character is built around doing massive burst damage, but at the cost of damage to yourself, sacrificing your own hit points in order to destroy your enemies. You splash blood around the battlefield and then turn that blood against your enemies. So if any of you are missing playing Dragon Age Origin, this is the perfect character for you. And also allows you to add a huge amount of burst damage to the arsenal of any party. I found this character thematic, fun, and strategic all at once, and it makes an excellent mod in my opinion, so I wanted to showcase it because of just how cool it is with all custom animations and everything, allowing you to rain blood upon your enemies and exsanguinate them at your leisure. Alright, let's get building. Before I begin though, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to AJ Hoy for the $10 donation, Fearsome Jin for the £10, Pink Wafer Lover for the £10, and Crater84 for the super generous $50 donation. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's make a bloody mess. Now, because we are using a mod here, I'm of course going to show you which mod we're using. So we're using the Blood Sorcerer, a Sorcerer subclass mod. Note that this is distinct from the Blood Mage mod, which I may also cover at some point because I really like that mod as well. But we're using this mod by Sturm1212 to give us the Blood Sorcerer subclass. This mod is available on Mac and console, so anybody can use it and has no required mods, so all you have to do is install it, and you're ready to go with the Blood Sorcerer. I'm using Astarion as the example character here because, of course, this is a blood-themed subclass, and so it feels right on theme with him, especially an Astarion who's gotten more in touch with his magic. I think this would also work very well thematically for a Dark Urge build, or if you're building this as any form of custom character, then, like most sorcerers, Halfling makes an excellent pick because the ability to reroll ones is just so useful for sorcerers in particular. But also any race with shield proficiency, like human, half-elf, especially half-wood elf, which gets bonus movement speed as well, is very useful for this subclass. You're often going to be playing at very low hit points, and so having higher armor class will prevent the enemies from just being able to take you out when you're at low hit points. Now, typically you won't be in too much danger because you will have killed things by reducing your hit points, and so there won't be any enemies left in order to kill you when you're at low HP, but increased armor class can be very useful for this character for risky situations. So for that reason, I would recommend half Wood Elf for movement speed and shield proficiency, Halfling to reroll ones, or Githyanki for medium armor as well as their better skills access with their astral knowledge, and Misty Step, which can get you out of dangerous situations if you are at low health because you have been bleeding yourself for power. At first level, we are of course taking Sorcerer, which gets us Constitution save proficiency, which of course is very nice for maintaining concentration, and we're taking the Blood Sorcery subclass. Now, we get a lot of bonus features when we enter into the subclass, so let's just quickly talk about those. Firstly, we get access to 3 different cantrips, in addition to the normal cantrips that we learn from Sorcerer. We get a lot of cantrips, so you'll always have something relevant to do on any turn of combat, even if you're a player who rests very infrequently and thus runs out of spell slots. The first of these is Blood Bolt, which does a d12 of damage, and deals 2 damage to you, but if you're bleeding, you take no damage. It also creates a puddle of blood at the location, which is very useful because this character has a lot of effects that interact with puddles of blood on the ground. Now, this is more damage than Firebolt or Ray of Frost, but it is relevant that it's necrotic damage, so it can't be doubled like Ray of Frost. That's actually going to be a theme with this build, or with this character, is a lot of the numbers on this class are very good, and so it looks overpowered at first glance because it does very high damage. And while it is very, very strong, just like every sorcerer, because it's primarily using necrotic damage, and so can't be doubled like lightning or cold damage with the wet condition, and doesn't have all of the synergies like the Hat of Fire Acuity and stuff like that, I've actually found this to be not more unbalanced than any other sorcerer is in actual play. The 1d12 damage, though, is a big nuke, especially at early levels. Taking 2 self-damage when you have very few hit points is a real cost, though, and having yourself be bleeding at early levels is quite dangerous because the 2 extra damage adds up pretty quickly when you have very few hit points. So you do have to be careful with using this spell. Luckily, you only have to you also get access to other cantrips, so you only have to use it when you need the extra damage. You also get Blood Sacrifice, which is a bonus action that lets you inflict bleed on yourself in order to attempt to cause the enemy to make a con save or they become bleeding. This is very useful because a lot of your effects trigger off of bleeding, and as you can see, you can cast Blood Sacrifice and then cast Blood Bolt, and you only take the damage from the bleeding, not the self-damage from the Blood Bolt, so there's some synergy there as well. Finally, you get Blood Needle, which maims the target, but causes you to take a bunch of damage. This is an incredibly powerful ability, because as a cantrip, stopping enemies from moving is super useful. Blood Needle is the one of these you'll use the most often, probably, especially at later levels. But again, you do have to be very, very careful with this, because the self-damage adds up. This is one that I think if the mod author is listening could use a slight nerf to the damage because the crowd control effect is so powerful, but the self-damage on this is pretty dangerous. Something else that's worth noting about these spells is that you only take the self-damage if the spell actually lands. If you miss with the spell, you don't take self-damage. For our first level spells, we also get 2 additional spells. The first of these is Bloodbath, which is an AoE spell. So it says 30 feet on the tooltip here, but it's actually 30 feet, and it's an area of effect spell like a fireball with a 15-foot radius where it lands, and everything within that 15-foot radius takes 1d4 necrotic damage and becomes bleeding. You can also cast this on yourself, but you have to specifically target it on yourself if you want to become bleeding for whatever reason, so you can cast it directly on top of yourself and it'll hit you. Otherwise, it actually won't hit the caster. Bloodbath does very minor damage, 1d4 necrotic damage and bleeding, so generally I wouldn't spend a level 1 spell slot on this. It is on a big AoE, so the enemies, if there's a lot of enemies in a relatively large area, then you can get a little bit of damage on all of them, but usually you're going to be better off casting other powerful sorcery spells. And Blood Rebuke gives you a reaction spell. This is basically Hellish Rebuke, but with necrotic damage. Does 2d10 necrotic, just like Hellish Rebuke, or 3d10 if you are bleeding, with a dexterity save for half. This is better than Hellish Rebuke because it's Hellish Rebuke but with an upside, but still not something that you really want to be doing with your sorcerer. So typically I wouldn't spend, I wouldn't put myself in a position to have this happen. But since we just get it as a spell known and don't have to spend a known slot on it, it will sometimes come up if your sorcerer takes a hit. So Blood Rebuke, because it is a lot of damage, so Blood Rebuke will come up sometimes, though you typically hope that it doesn't. For our other features, we get Sacrificial Spell, which makes our spells ignore resistance and immunity to necrotic damage. Honestly, this is sort of sadly necessary for this character to function in Baldur's Gate 3. There's just so many enemies that are resistant or immune to necrotic, so a character themed around necrotic damage just doesn't work without this ability. It is a very powerful ability, though, and will help your damage land always. We also get Grim Harvest, so if we kill a creature with a spell, we have the same as the Necromancer Wizard class feature, where we regain hit points based on the spell level used. So killing an enemy with a cantrip won't do anything, but if we kill enemies with our other spells, which we will be doing pretty frequently, we'll gain some self-healing, which is how the character can maintain their hit points. And finally, we have advantage on attack rolls with spells while we are bleeding, so our cantrip attacks are made with advantage when we're bleeding. What you can see from adding this all up is that the character wants to be bleeding a lot, but you have to be very careful with that because it reduces your hit points. And any healing cures bleeding, so as you lose the powerful buff if you try to heal yourself in order to avoid the self-damage. So there's a really interesting tension there that I really have enjoyed playing with. Finally, for the rest of our level 1 build, we are going to be taking a pretty standard array of sorcerer spells, though remember that our combat abilities are mostly covered by our blood sorcerer spells, so we don't need to spend that many spell slots known on combat spells. We're going to be taking Minor Illusion to group enemies for our powerful AoE damage, Ray of Frost, which is still just very, very good, although we do have the Maim, which is better than the 10-foot movement reduction. Ray of Frost is still the best combat cantrip, can do more damage if the enemy is wet, and also, we're creating a lot of blood surfaces. Ray of Frost can be used to freeze those, because blood can be frozen, and then you get a ready-made ice surface. Blade Ward is very useful for this character. This does have the damage that you take from bleeding. So bleeding is slashing damage, so Blade Ward giving you resistance means you only take 1 damage per turn. That can actually be very relevant, especially if you precast this before going into combat. And then Mage Hand or another utility spell like Light can be very useful, or Friends, because this character as a sorcerer is likely going to be your party face. For our level 1 spell selection here, we're going to take Shield and Magic Missile. Shield is going to help defend ourselves as we get low, and Magic Missile can't miss, so it's still going to be very, very useful as a combat option. Even though we have other combat spells, Magic Missile's inability to miss is still critically important for any character that has access to it. For our ability score selection here, we're going to be taking 16 Constitution, really important that this character has lots of hit points, and 16 Charisma, as well as 14 Dexterity and 12 Wisdom. We'll want to fix our initiative later on, because +2 initiative is definitely on the low end, but the 14 Dexterity should be good enough, and we need the hit points, as well as the concentration saves. And then, of course, for our skill selection here, you're going to be taking as many of the dialogue skills as you want, certainly including Persuasion. You can also pick up Insight and have a spread something along these lines in order for your character to act as a party face. All right, that's it for level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we're going to be taking our second level of Sorcerer, and we get access to meta magic features, but nothing new in particular from Blood Sorcerer. We get another spell, though, and the spell we're going to take is Mage Armor, unless you have another character that can cast it for you. Mage Armor is incredibly useful for this character because, like I said, you want to have high armor class, and we don't have any armor proficiencies, so we need Mage Armor in order to have higher armor class. Often I would suggest a control spell, something like Tasha's Hideous Laughter or Fog Cloud at this level, but this character, because of the constant self-damage, is much worse at maintaining concentration on spells. So unless it's very powerful, we usually don't want to grab concentration spells at these early levels especially. For our meta magic here, we are going to be taking Twin Spell, of course, and Distant Spell. Distant Spell means that we will be able to land our powerful damage from further away, so it gives us a lot more agency in combat, and lets us play much more safely. And Twin Spell, of course, lets us double up on our huge nukes that we're going to be dishing out constantly, so is very good for the Blood Sorcerer. At character level 3, we get our second level spells, and we get 2 new second level spells from Blood Sorcerer. The first of these is Blood Ray, which is basically Scorching Ray, but does a little bit more damage, and also includes self-damage. Now, the Scorching Ray damage, each ray will deal a d4 of damage to you. So if you hit with all 3 rays, you're going to be taking 3d4 of damage, which for a sorcerer with 23 hit points can be half of your hit points in a single hit. So you, again, have to be quite careful with Blood Ray. Now, if you're bleeding, you'll be making this attack with advantage and not taking any self-damage. So you can see why we really want to be bleeding a lot on this character. So Blood Ray is very good in that case, but you usually don't want to use this spell unless you are currently bleeding. So make sure that you can use that. The bonus action cantrip that causes you to bleed is very useful to set this up and give you advantage on the attacks. Blood Spike does a big, it creates a huge AoE damage burst on a blood surface. So the characters, any character that's standing on a blood surface will take 4d10 damage, and it will do damage in an AoE around it with a dexterity save for half. This is another big damage nuke, which will be very useful for burst to damage in various situations. This is a huge nuke, and doesn't do any self-damage, so as long as the enemy is on a blood surface, which you can create, of course, yourself, or just by whacking them with a weapon with another character, then you can use Blood Spike for a big damage burst. For our spell selection at this level, for our level 2 spells, we're going to be taking Misty Step. Again, we're mostly avoiding concentration spells, and we don't need damaging spells like Scorching Ray, because we have super powerful versions of those spells from our Blood Sorcery. And for our magic, we are, of course, going to be taking Quicken Spell, just like every sorcerer has before us. At character level 4, we get access to our first feat. Nothing new from Blood Sorcerer at this level, but we get a feat, and the feat that we're going to take is Alert. This lets us get away with having taken 14 dexterity to start with, because we'll now have a +7 to our initiative, and this character does a ton of bonus damage to start fights off with, or does a ton of damage to start off fights, so you want to kill enemies before they get to act with your huge amount of burst damage. I will say that for this character, going first is less important than for other spellcasters, because we have fewer control spells. We're more damage focused, so we don't need as badly to go first. But of course, the goal is to kill enemies in a single turn of spellcasts and attacks from the rest of our party, so going first is still going to be really helpful. We can blow up enemies before they have a chance to act. Alert, obviously, the best feat for Honor Mode, so of course we're going to take it. For our cantrip selection at this level, we can pick up another utility spell. I do like still, even though we have other combat cantrips, having Bone Chill, because preventing enemies from healing can be very, very useful throughout the game, and giving undead disadvantage on attack rolls is incredibly strong in Act 2. Also, of course, this benefits from all of our synergies with necrotic damage, so Bone Chill is very useful here as well. It's just a really useful spell for us to have. For our spell selection at this level, we can go back and pick up more utility spells. I will say that having at least one control spell is still really good, though, so I would probably just pick Hold Person here. We also can get guaranteed critical hits on our Blood Rays if we use Hold Person on the enemy beforehand, and we don't have to be bleeding every turn of combat. It is harder to maintain concentration on spells when you're taking self-damage, but you don't have to do self-damage. You can just cast other stuff and use Hold Person to lock down large groups of enemies, which is incredibly powerful. At character level 5, we get our 3rd level spells and 2 new Blood Sorcery spells. Sanguine Feast lets us do 4d6 necrotic damage and heal for half of the damage that we deal in a 10-foot radius around us. Typically, this is not a very good spell. A level 3 spell slot for this little damage is just not that exciting. There, you have better ways to heal, like drinking a potion if you need a burst of healing, so I would usually avoid wasting a level 3 spell slot on Sanguine Feast. Crimson Blast, on the other hand, is like Super Fireball, dealing 10d6 necrotic damage. It does do 1d8 damage to you per target hit, and only half damage if you are bleeding, so you're still going to take a big chunk of damage when you use the spell, but the outgoing damage for this is definitely worth it. This is a huge amount of burst damage with basically a larger damage fireball that does damage to you, so it's one you're going to want to use pretty frequently. For our level 3 spells from Sorcerer at this level, we're of course going to pick up Counterspell. Counterspell is incredibly important for every spellcaster to have, and this one is no exception. It's also something we can do without having to concentrate on a spell. At character level 6, we get 2 new subclass features. The first of these is Blood Magic. When we deal necrotic damage with a spell, we add our Charisma modifier to the damage. This is basically the same as the Draconic Sorcerer class feature that adds your Charisma modifier to your appropriate damage type. Blood Magic is incredible, especially with our Blood Rays, because it will deal the additional Charisma damage per ray, just like the Draconic Sorcerer and Scorching Ray, for a massive amount of burst damage with that spell. Secondly, we get Blood Vitality, which causes us to regain 2d4 hit points whenever we start our turn in a blood surface in combat. Now, this is very good for sustain, and of course we're taking a lot of self-damage, so it's useful. But you do have to be careful with this, because any healing that you receive removes bleeding. Since this character often wants to be bleeding, whether you stand in a blood surface at the start of your turn or not is a decision that you're going to have to make at the beginning, in basically every combat that you're in. If you do accidentally receive the healing, though, this character does have a bonus action to cause itself to bleed, so it's pretty easy to fix, but this is something that you do have to be aware of when you're playing, that this will turn off your own bleeding in order to, and can cause you to lose the bonuses that you get when you are bleeding. For our spells at this level, we're going to pick up a control spell, although I have mentioned that we typically are not taking as many concentration spells as most spellcasters. Taking Hypnotic Pattern is still just too good to pass up on. This is such a powerful spell that just instant wins encounters, and sometimes you're at low health or don't want to take self-damage and need something good to do with your turn. Hypnotic Pattern is always going to be an excellent option in pretty much any fight available. At level 7, we get our 4th level spells, including a new Blood Sorcerer spell. This spell is Bloodstorm, which is a larger AoE but lower damage fireball, essentially. It's 3d8 plus 5d6 necrotic damage, so with a 20-foot radius, so it is a larger AoE than our Blood Fireball from the previous level, but lower overall damage. Usually you aren't going to use this unless enemies are really spread out and you just need a little bit of damage on all of them, so typically you're just going to be casting the lower level spell instead. For our spell selection at this level, with our 4th level spells, we have a couple options, but I'm still going to suggest taking Wall of Fire. This spell is just so invaluable for so many fights in the game and lets you do just solve a lot of encounters on its own. Any fight where enemies are in a narrow corridor or coming at you through a doorway, Wall of Fire will just instantly win. You could take Blight because it is another necrotic damage spell, which we do have synergies with, but Blight is still pretty inefficient, so I would typically avoid taking Blight here. Alright, character level 8. We get our second feat, and of course we're simply going to improve our charisma. This character just needs to be hitting its shots. Now, you can get away with lower charisma on this character than with most spellcasters, because we are mostly doing damage and a lot of them have saves for half rather than doing nothing, and we have advantage on a lot of our spells that require attack rolls as long as we're bleeding, so we don't need to have as high of a hit bonus or save DC as other characters, but it's still really good, and it increases our damage per beam with our blood beams, with our blood rays, so charisma increase is still incredible for this character. For our other level 4 spell at this level, at this point you can go back and grab a utility spell, something that you feel like your party might need, whether that be invisibility or greater invisibility, or anything along those lines. At this point you should have a good sense of what your party actually needs. Another fun one you can take is False Life, just to constantly have a few extra hit points for this character, which can still use them to mitigate the self-damage. This can be a useful spell for you to cast before combat as well, but usually I'm going to take a more powerful utility spell. The best combat spell is probably going to be Confusion or Banishment, because these can be cast in some encounters for good effect. Confusion doesn't hit allies, so if your allies are entangled with the enemies, then Confusion is good. Banishment is very good against enemies with low charisma saving throws because it targets charisma, so I would suggest one of those two. Alright, character level 9, we get our 5th level Blood Sorcerer spell, and this spell is awesome. Grasp of the Dead does 8d8 necrotic damage in a huge radius. I think this is a 30-foot radius. It's not listed on the tooltip, but it's a big AoE spell. And it will do 8d8 necrotic damage and inflict Restrained on any enemy that's standing in a blood surface, or any creature that's standing in a blood surface. Since all of our spells create large blood surfaces, it's pretty easy to fill the condition here, and of course you're a sorcerer, so you can do a quickened blood fireball to create a big blood surface, and then put Grasp of the Dead for even more damage and restraining those enemies. Restrained is a brutal condition, so inflicting it in an AoE is really fun. This spell is really fun to try to set up because it requires you to sort of think about your spell order. Since it's a 5th level spell, it's a big investment, but it's so powerful when it lands. And making sure that enemies are on blood surfaces in order to actually use it is a really fun puzzle with this class, and when you do so, it's incredibly effective. For our other spell at this level, we're going to take Hold Monster, which can be used to just win some encounters in the late game and just gives us more options for locking down enemies. Just a very, very powerful control spell. Again, you will use control spells mostly in fights where you aren't going to be taking a lot of self-damage, so you can Hold Monster and then have other allies kill that enemy rather than doing it yourself, but it's still just such a good spell that it's worth grabbing. At level 10, we get access to another cantrip, and you all know what we're going to take here. It's going to be True Strike to give stress nosebleeds to the people in the comments. Right on theme for Blood Sorcery. And then for our spell selection, we can go back for another utility spell from earlier levels. A good combat spell if you still want more combat options. It's Slow, because it can be used in late game boss fights, although it does require your concentration. But probably you're going to be picking up some kind of utility spell like Greater Invisibility, just something that your party needs at this point. You should have a good idea of what that is. For our meta magic here, we are going to be taking Heightened Spell. This gives enemies disadvantage on the first saving throw against, for example, Hold Person or Hold Monster, so lets us lock down enemies incredibly easily, or Hypnotic Pattern, and is a very powerful meta magic feature as well. I think that that Heightened Spell is pretty underrated, actually, because Quicken Spell is so broken, but Heightened Spell is almost as good, so though it usually gets overlooked, this is still a super powerful option. And at character level 11, we get our 6th level Blood Sorcerer spell, as well as 2 new class features. The first of these is advantage on attack rolls against bleeding enemies. Now, we often are able to set up advantage on our own attack rolls, so this is just a nice quality of life feature, but doesn't make a huge change typically. But while we are bleeding, we also deal an extra 1d6 necrotic damage whenever we deal necrotic damage. This is a incredibly powerful effect, so we deal a d6 plus our charisma modifier in extra necrotic damage, so it's going to let our damage keep up even with an arcane acuity'd fire sorcerer or a wet damage cold caster in the late game, because blood power adds a ton of extra damage, so with our blood rays, etc., we're doing a bunch of damage. We also get a 6th level spell, and this is sort of Super Disintegrate. This is a 12d6 plus 40 necrotic damage to a single enemy, and if it goes to 0 hit points, it gets disintegrated. You take 40 damage when you cast it, unless you're bleeding, so you do not want to cast this spell if you aren't bleeding. And typically, I would say, because this is a Constitution save, you often don't want to cast the spell anyways. Now, enemies will have disadvantage on the con saves, because you'll be making them bleed very frequently, but Crimson Leech for a 6th level spell is a lot of damage and will kill a lot of enemies very, very effectively. But for a 6th level spell, one-shotting one enemy isn't what I often want. I would rather spend my 6th level spells on things that will just win entire encounters on their own. Nevertheless, this is still a really powerful damage spell, obviously, that's going to kill enemies when you just need a gigantic nuke, which of course sometimes you do. For our spell selection at this level, we're going to take Globe of Invulnerability. Not only does this just win encounters on its own, this also totally prevents all the self-damage that this character does without turning off any of its effects, so you can throw around your spells with perfect impunity while you're in the Globe of Invulnerability and just not have to worry about any of the self-damaging effects. So this has incredible synergy, as well as just being one of, if not the best spell in the game, all on its own. And finally, at character level 12, we are going to take our last feat, and that feat is going to be a bonus to our charisma. For our spell selection, again, we're going back for utility spells here. Our 6th level spell slots are going to be taken by Globe of Invulnerability, and the Blood Disintegrate, which I'm immediately forgetting the name of, so you likely won't want to spend another spell known slot on a 6th level spell. I would still avoid Circle of Death, because we just have much better damaging effects, and Circle of Death is very, very low damage for a 6th level spell. But you can go back and grab any of the other utility spells that you might need, or just pick up Banishment because it can help win some dangerous late game fights where enemies have low charisma saves. Alright, that is our Blood Sorcerer, but of course we can improve it even further with equipment, so let's talk about that. 4 items for this character. There's a couple item synergies that we get access to that are particularly cool. So firstly, just like every spellcaster, we want to pick up increases to our spell save DCs and spell attack rolls. So any item that gives us that is going to be our #1 priority. Things like the Fistbreaker Helm are incredible for this character. Initiative bonuses are also really important, so we should keep an eye out for those as we level up as well. Save DC, attack rolls, initiative, those are the main things that this character needs. Items, there's also, though, some particularly interesting synergies for this character. So firstly, of course, the best in-slot weapon is going to be the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. Almost every spell that we cast is a necromancy spell, so we will get tons of free spells by using our necromancy spells, and they're very, very high damage, so it will be very easy to fulfill the condition to kill an enemy, get a free spell, and cast another super powerful spell. You can use this to chain 6th level Blood Disintegrate over and over again with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy to just constantly kill a lot of enemies. And so this one item will break the character in half because we get super powerful damaging necromancy spells, much better than the default necromancy spells available in the game. Of course, Markahesh gear is also always incredible, so this is going to be a great alternative. You could also go for Dual Wielder and take both of these, but the Staff of Cherished Necromancy is so good that I highly recommend using it even over Markahesh gear for this character. If you have shield proficiency, your best bet is going to be Ketheric's Shield, increasing your save DC and attack rolls, so that's going to be the best in slot there. Anything that gives you damage reduction is also really, really useful. The Bone Spike Garb, for example, just reduces 2 incoming damage. So this will turn off the bleed damage that you are going to be taking. You have bleed does 2 damage every turn. The Bone Spike Garb prevents that damage, not only causing you to not take damage, but also preventing you from having to make concentration checks on any spells that you're concentrating on. The best version, of course, of that is going to be the Helldusk armor, which I usually don't even bother recommending because it's best in slot for every character. But for this character, the damage reduction has particular synergy with what you're trying to do. Of course, robes that increase your spell save DCs and attack rolls, like the Robe of the Weave, are also very good. So that is another great option as well. The Helldusk gloves give you spell attack rolls and save DCs, so once you have Helldusk gear, you're probably just going to be running around in that. And similarly, the Amulet of Greater Health gives you a lot of hit points, which helps mitigate the self-damage that you are going to be constantly taking. Other than all this, though, just any normal caster gear, like I said, initiative bonuses and spell save DC and attack roll bonuses are all that you really need out of your items for this character. Special mention also for the Potent Robe, because the temporary hit points that you get every turn aren't healing, so they don't prevent bleeding, but they will tank the damage that you're going to be taking every turn, and the extra damage on your cantrips is really good. You're casting a lot of cantrips with advantage, so extra damage on those is awesome. One item that looks like it might synergize that I don't recommend is the Ring of Regeneration. The Ring of Regeneration is going to turn off your bleeding when you get the heal from it, so you will usually want to avoid this. You can control whether you're getting the heal by not standing from the blood surface healing, by not standing in blood surfaces. The Ring of Regeneration takes away your options to stay bleeding if that's something that you want. So I usually wouldn't recommend this item for this character. Overall, though, you have a lot of great options for gear, including some really broken options, and will typically just want to gear with spell save DC increases, just like every other caster. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the the Blood Sorcerer, Bloodthirster from Warhammer, of course. And if you have, then feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 builds, Baldur's Gate 3 mod highlights like this one, and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. and I will catch you next time.